Yeah, there's quite a variety of ones. The one you look up in the if you get the modern Irish English dictionary, you're going to get Mac Tíre, which means son of the country, which is its literal translation, but it means basically a kind of a creature who roams around the countryside, and that's what you'd get in terms of a modern day wolf in an Irish English dictionary. There are other ones as well. There's quite a few actually, but some of the etymology of them is quite tricky. The one that stands out, it's quite common as well, is Madra Alta, which means Alta would be an older version of wild, so a wild dog. Coo Alta, so a wild hound. And these would all be references to wolves. More interesting one is Foel Coo, so evil hound, and foel is an old word for evil. So there's quite a variety of ones like that. There's also a few more less clear ones. I gave a talk once, and I had down on my list as possibility was a Kieran, which means screecher, and an Italian person said that was very similar to what they would use, and lay down as well, which is a similar type thing. So referring to the kind of the vocalizations of wolves. And there's probably a few more out there as well. So one of the things that's very interesting about the names is when you use the word like Coo and Madra, if you go back far enough, they could either be wolves or dogs. So we can never be absolutely certain unless you're able to trace, an individual place name back to its origins and be very clear about which one it's referring to. It's problematic. It's problematic for a number of reasons. A couple of investigations went back in the early part of the 1900s to look at the actual documentary evidence, and nothing was found. It's also problematic in the sense that the person involved also seemed to have a pack of Irish wolfhounds, which were probably Victorian recreations, and it may be the case that they were kind of justifying their Irish wolfhound existence. But I have no doubt that there were certainly ones in the 1770s. If the 1786 is apocryphal, which is possible, I have no doubt they were around in the 1770s. So it wouldn't be that terrible if 1786 was a problem. Which it kind of is at this stage as well. But like all historical stuff, you're going back to the 1700s. Just because there isn't documentation around now doesn't mean there necessarily wasn't documentation, in the 1800s when these records are first recorded. So it's hard to be absolutely certain, but there is a question mark over the 1786. But I would be absolutely certain of the 1770s. Yeah, it's quite a big contrast, actually. There's no doubt in my mind that the native Irish definitely killed them. They were obliged, the chieftains were obliged to hunt them. But I don't get any indication when I look at the records that there was ever any real idea of exterminating them. There was a question of keeping the numbers in balance and keeping the numbers under control. But certainly not, I didn't get the feeling from reading what I saw that there was this idea, well, we have to exterminate all wolves. So I think there was a kind of an uneasy truce. If the numbers started to get too much, if there was too many sheep kills or cattle kills, then they certainly went out and trimmed numbers back. But no evidence really suggests they went out to try and exterminate them entirely off the landscape. Different story with the incoming settlers in the 17th century. In effect, they were kind of sold a bit of a PR piece. They were told that, the natives were friendly, we weren't, that the land had been cleared, it wasn't, and that there was very, very few wolves, and there was plenty of wolves. So they were trying to encourage them to come over. Effectively, it's a touch of the selling land in Florida, which is just marshland. There's a touch of an element of that about it. And in fact, the plantation in Munster almost collapsed entirely. I mean, a lot of them returned. This is why it was never as strong in Munster as comparison to Ulster, because the conditions were much tougher than they'd ever anticipated. So with the Cromwellians, it was very different. There was definitely targets. The targets were threefold. There were priests, which were £10 bounty for a priest, which is a lot of money in those days in the 1600s. You can imagine. I mean, we're talking, salary of an ordinary labourer of probably several years. Tories, because of course they were not royalists, and they despised Tories. In fact, the word Tory, as we refer to the Tory party today, comes from Ireland, because they were on the run, in many of them in Ireland. And that was, I think it was also £10. And then it was wolves. So £6 for female, £5 for male, £3 for juveniles, and 10 shillings for cubs. So the females were valued more so because of their breeding potential than the male wolves were. So definitely there was a different mindset. The mindset was, let's get rid of these as fast as we can. So they saw them as a threat to the colonization. They saw them as a threat to the incomers as well. Absolutely. They even banned the export of Irish wolf dogs in an attempt to try and speed up the process, because Irish wolf dogs were heavily valued and were seen as rare and unusual creatures, and they were often given as gifts from Ireland. So there was a real concern that the Irish wolf dog would disappear. And I'm not talking about the modern Irish wolfhound. This was probably the original Irish wolf dog, or in my view, a second generation Irish wolf dog. I think the modern Irish wolfhound, and the Irish wolfhound people don't like me for saying this, I think is a Victorian recreation. Yeah, I think you have to have a landscape that's appropriate for wild wolves, and the reality is, by 1900 Ireland had 1% forestry cover. I mean, we literally had no forests, and what few forests were left were in places like Killarney National Park and a few protected landed estates around the country. So in terms of open grassland and open mountains with kind of semi-wild woods, they really weren't there, because the farming pre-famine times went all the way up into the upland areas, and they were cleared as a result. So we pretty had a barren landscape. We're still the least forested country in Europe, percentage-wise. So I think deforestation and its impact on the native wildlife was part of the story. I mean, they do talk about the strategic burning of forests, Kilcash outside of Clonmel, which was not even harvested for the expensive oak trees. They literally burnt it to the ground because it was full of rebels, woodkern, and wolves as well, and possibly Tories and priests. There were hideout areas. Parts of County Wicklow were the same, and there were other strategic burnings as well. So there was a definite link. They saw the wilder landscape that was there associated with wild animals, but associated with the wild Irish as well, as being something they needed to get control of. And I would often describe it as the shiring of Ireland. This managed landscape with large estates, with tenant farmers, with complete control over the environment, the shooting of vermin, the taking out vermin, the growing of or the raising of game birds and deer parks, and anything wild was kind of seen as a threat almost. Yeah, there's a fantastic piece of work by Joy McCracken. She was a kind of she's deceased now, a good few years. She wrote a book where she tried called Irish Woods in Tudor Times. So she tried to reconstruct the landscape of Ireland based on the available evidence at the time, around 1600. Now, there's been some subsequent work done, and she's not entirely accurate, but it was a fantastic first attempt at this piece of work. And her view was that about 12.5% of Ireland was native forest. So you're looking at, effectively the equivalent of 2 to 3 medium counties was covered in native forest. And that was scattered pretty much around the country, although somewhat concentrated in the bigger river valleys. So there was, substantial amounts of native oak forest or semi-wild forest in Ireland up to the early 1600s. By 1700, after the Cromwellian campaigns, that was down to 2.5% approximately. So that's a phenomenal change. So you're looking at losing effectively almost 80% of what was there in terms of native forest. Well, my view would be, you'd start with the national parks. So likes of Killarney, Glenveigh, and then some of the major mountain ranges that maybe don't have national parks, the Wicklow Mountains, the Galtee Mountains, Connemara, although there are challenges in the west of Ireland for wolves because of the lack of prey species, because the vegetation can be so poor. But certainly you could see a recurrence in most of the major mountain ranges, and certainly in some river valleys as well, if they weren't suitable for agriculture. And in a funny sort of way, we kind of see the land that isn't suitable for agriculture because a lot of it is being afforested, but obviously with commercial non-native species. And we're up to probably about 11, 12, 13% at the moment, which is close to the 1600 figure. But, 85, 90% of it is things like lodgepole pine, Sitka spruce. They're commercial species planted in minimum distances. They have minimum biodiversity. I mean, they're quite dark underneath them. If you go in and actually underneath them, they're very dark. Even in terms of invertebrates, they're very low. So they're not really suitable. What you want is kind of open to scrub forest or high oak forest, which would be typical of what you see in some of the kind of, not so much the cowboy movies in America, but more the Mohican style movies in America, where you had a kind of open rolling forest with patches of open area and rivers and beaver. You want that kind of landscape, but you do want upland areas tend to be the areas that tend to be most like that as well.